Welcome back to Power CEOs, Truth Behind the Business. We have been talking about inner child. We've been talking about how do we check in and how do we start our day with intentionality and focus. As you recall, or if you're just tuning in, we talked about knowing what 3 things we're going to do today and prioritizing them and focusing on them first before we do anything else so we can stay focused. So as we move forward with this, Jennifer Cahill is here in studio, and you are a jet setter. You are a powerhouse entrepreneur. And you know, we do a lot of things. How do you manage your sleep? Because when you're going from time zone to time zone to this time zone, you know, managing your sleep for that reset and that foundation of health is essential in entrepreneurship. If we're tired, we don't make the right decision. We don't have speed of implementation. We don't show up for the investors or for the teams in the best way. So how do you manage that critical piece?
One important thing for me is coffee consumption. I'm very thoughtful. I will have 1 cup of coffee. That cup of coffee has to be had before 11 a.m. And then if I want caffeine in the afternoon, I only have matcha because it has L-theanine. And L-theanine actually helps us to sleep better than normal. The second thing I do is, despite all of my schedules and all of my travel, I am adherent 1,000% to being sure I get at least 8 hours sleep. I can survive on 7. We all have our numbers. Some people, my husband, can survive on 4. I'm not that person. So I make sure whatever time of flight is, whatever time of dinner is, I have been known to exit my own parties. I've had parties of 100 people at my house, and I'll be like, peace out, guys. I'm done. You know, I'm not going to be in there. So I honor myself by going to bed at the right time. And then one of my favorite techniques to de-stress, I'll give you 2 parts to actually the technique. One comes from a CEO friend of mine who's a brilliant, brilliant entrepreneur. And what that is before you go to bed, you write down 3 things you're grateful for. So just like in the morning, we start our day with gratitude, we end our day with gratitude. And then in the evening, you write down 3 things you're grateful for, and you ask yourself, how could I have lived today better? Was I rude to anybody? Did I not voice my concerns in a meeting? Was there somebody who I could have spoken to in a more kind way? And when we begin to do this, you're giving yourself context not from a place of judgment, but from a place of curiosity, because you don't want to repeat the same patterns like Groundhog Day over and over. The third thing you do is you write down, what are you proud of yourself for? What are the things that nobody else might ever acknowledge you for? And then I'll give you this technique from another CEO friend of mine who said, if she has a problem, she imagines putting it on a metaphorical shelf. And I know many thought leaders and CEOs who do this, where you put the problem on this metaphorical shelf in your mind, and you ask your inner wisdom, whatever you want, your higher self, to work out the problem while you sleep. So when you wake up, you have the solution.
I actually practice that as well. You know, and I really like that concept. I don't do it as a mental shelf. I actually write it down.
Oh.
I write it down, and then for some reason, when I write it down, my brain knows that I don't have to think about this as I'm going into sleep. And so it's really helped me to facilitate as well. I love your techniques. And so as you're doing this, you're making sure you're religious about your sleep. Hello, I would never leave my own party. I'm the one who's like, okay, it's done, everybody out. I shut it down. So maybe that's an inner child work, but it's my party.
It's my party. You're going to stay as long as I want you here.
But, you know, I think it's very critical because I want to move into what happens in business when we are showing up as our best self, when we have good sleep hygiene, when we are doing the work internally and managing our stress and building mental resilience. How do we then show up in our business? What does that translate to? Because it's not something that you could put a ROI dollar amount necessarily to. However, give us some insights on the business world. When we focus on our self-care, what does that translate into in our business life?
I'm going to pause for a moment and backtrack here, Jen. One thing I want to highlight is, say you've had a terrible night's sleep, and I've been there, right? We've all been there. You get 3 hours sleep, kid, whatever the situation is. I would actually alert all of my meetings that day. If I knew I wasn't mentally, emotionally there, at my team meetings of my internal team, I would give them a choice. I'd say, guys, listen, I've had 3 or 4 hours worth of sleep. I may not be at my best. Would you like to postpone the meeting? So I inform my colleagues, because part of that is good communication. 2 is a really cool technique I learned from a brilliant thought leader who used to run global marketing for a huge organization. She said she has her team, every time they do a global meeting, put a number from 0 to 5 in the chat, and they don't have to explain it. 5 means you're like, yes, I got 10 hours of sleep. I feel amazing. 0 means don't bother me, right? And so, but just by putting that in the chat, then you have context to know what you can count on people for on your team and yourself that day. So to answer your question of what it provides though, when it, in terms of, let's say you do get enough sleep, that gives us access to our prefrontal cortex. When we have not had enough sleep, Jen, we're accessing our amygdala, our fight or flight brain. We're coming from anxiety, stress, anxiousness, frustration, upset. Those are all things that cause cortisol in our system. And yet, when we find our balance, then we're able to think more clearly. We're able to make better decisions, to be less reactive. And I think that's what's really going to make a big difference for team members.
I love it. And you know, that whole concept of being proactive versus reactive is so incredibly vitally important, because if we're constantly reacting, we are not our highest selves. We are not the best leaders if we're in reaction mode, because we're elevated, we're stressed. We don't have a lot of bandwidth to actually take a breath and sort through what we need to sort through. So as we move forward, how do we then instill this in our teams? I know that you have exited successfully. I know that you as a human being are taking care of yourselves, but it's equally as important for us to encourage our team in some of these self-care boundaries. Like, some of these practices are essential. How do you take that and lead from the front and encourage them in a way that makes sense?
I love that question, Jen. So I'll give you a couple of tips. One is I used to blink a book. Do you know Blinkist?
No.
Oh my God, it's amazing. You could like blink the 4 agreements in a matter of 15 minutes with the team. So once a month, I would blink a personal development class, a book with my team. And so we would go ahead and listen to Think and Grow Rich or the 4 agreements, and then have a team lunch around it and a powwow. What do we learn from this? How can we better be ourselves? Now, I'll give you an example of where self-awareness is critical in a leader in terms of how we relate to others. We often don't realize how other people are upset. So one thing I was taught by Dr. Paul White, who you should definitely have on the show, is he's the co-author of the book Appreciation at Work that he co-wrote with Dr. Gary Chapman of the 5 Love Languages. Number 1, find out how your team wants to be appreciated, because if they are not appreciated in a way that they can receive it, then it can create them to feel unhappy, dissatisfied, or leave. I'll give you a great example. I had a guy in our Bay Area office after the acquisition who we hired, and I said, Daryl, you know, how do you want to be appreciated? And he said, Jen, please don't ever acknowledge me publicly. That would be my worst thing ever. Don't send me don't send a group email. Don't acknowledge me on a call. He said, send me a private note. But think of how many of us as CEOs would be like, oh, of course I'm going to acknowledge our best player, right? But you have to do it in a way that works. The second thing is being consciously aware, as my friend Arthur would say, of how is your behavior impacting others. I was once head down in a spreadsheet doing my work, and I hear somebody in my office saying, Jen, J Hill, I need your help. That was my old nickname. And I'm like, I can't, you know, I'm too busy, right? And I felt it viscerally. By the end of that day, my spidey sense was tingling. And luckily, I talked to her. We'll call her Mary. I said, Mary, we're about the last 2 people in the office. I said, are you okay? I said, I think you feel a little bit like dismissed when I brushed you off earlier. And the other thing I sat with her knee to knee, because sitting knee to knee with somebody, even if you're not touching, creates a limbic connection. And I said to her, I'm so sorry. I apologize that you felt dismissed earlier. And she broke down in tears. And she said, thank you so much. I was going to go home and look for another job if you hadn't talked to me.
Oh, wow. That's the power of tuning in to other people and to being on their map. I call it being on their map.
Yeah.
When we're on their map, not on ours, then we're able to truly have that deeper connection. And that's really where we build trust. That's where we build our teams and we become, and I know it's not okay to say we're a work family or whatever, but we have that sort of familial comfort when we have those deep relationships and we do hit people. And you know, something that's interesting, and if you want to comment on it, I would be very interested to hear your comment. You know, we've been discouraged for generations for talking about bringing emotions to work. You know, you have to have separation of church and state. What happens there can't come here. We can't talk about feelings. Feelings don't exist in the workplace. Like, that has been ingrained in us for many years, and we're now shifting the pendulum back to we need a psychologically safe space. How do we shift that pendulum for some people who have been ingrained for 40 years maybe, and no, there is no emotion in work, and shift that pendulum so that our younger generations who are very accepting of that can feel that?
Great question, and I'm going to quote my sister on this. So I love my sister, and she's a brilliant animal trainer, as is her husband. And one of the things that she taught me in animal training is what she calls small approximations. Let's say you want to train a tiger or a dolphin or whatever it is. You don't expect the dolphin to jump through the hoop on the first try. You give them treats. Every time the dolphin gets near the hoop, you give it more treats. Okay, then it jumps through the hoop for fun. You give it more treats. So you positively reinforce through small approximations. So if you have somebody who's steadfast, I've been doing this way and I will not show my emotions, then when the person does share something vulnerable, you really acknowledge them. I'm so happy you shared that with me. Thank you, Jane or Bill or Jim or whomever it might be. And you acknowledge them so that way they feel appreciated, heard, and seen. And then that in turn allows them to understand how great it feels to be acknowledged.
Thank you for that so much. We do have to take a brief break, but we will be right back after these messages.